Hello and welcome to Buy the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with a discussion of Plato's Gorgias. Last time we saw that Gorgias is a dialogue in which Plato's teacher or mentor, Socrates, is meeting a famous man in the ancient world, Gorgias. Gorgias is famous for traveling around and teaching the art of rhetoric, or how to speak well in public and influence people and persuade people of things. And everybody else is interested in listening to Gorgias put on a display of his talents, his rhetorical powers. But we can see from the beginning that Socrates is not really interested in that. He showed up late and he missed Gorgias' speech. But he wants to talk to Gorgias, not to hear him lecture or give a speech, but rather to have a conversation with him. And we're going to witness, that conversation or that dialogue and the way that Socrates uses speech in a different way than Gorgias, not to persuade masses of people, but rather to try to, in a more one-on-one kind of way, to delve into topics and see, can we figure out, the truth of things. And the topic that Socrates is interested in going into with Gorgias is, and this is typical of Socrates, he's going to look at not, some random topic or something he happens to be interested in. He's going to look in, what does the person I'm talking to know the most about? What is their focus of their life? And then he questions them about that. So something about which they should know the answer, they believe they know the answer, but as it turns out, Socrates always shows that they actually don't have a good answer for the question. In other words, he's always exposing that the people he's talking to don't really know what their life is about. Their life is all about something, but when you ask them to explain it, they can't really explain it. And this is not accidental. It's very vital to what Socrates is doing. He's looking for wisdom. He's looking for understanding of the meaning of life. So he's always looking to see, what does this person believe their life is about? And then he helps them to see that they're missing something on this. They haven't really thought it through. In this case, his question is the power of rhetoric. So Gorgias prides himself most of all on being a rhetorician and teaching rhetoric. And Socrates says, presumably this is an art, although we're going to see that Socrates doesn't think it really is an art in the strict sense. But Gorgias treats it as an art, which means a form of knowledge that can be learned, it can be taught. For producing some particular product or result. And he's going to look at, this art. Well, what is it for? What are you doing with this art? What exactly are you accomplishing? And in their initial discussion, there's a little bit of back and forth on this, because Gorgias is defining rhetoric as a mastery of speech, an art of speaking, but Socrates points out there's many people who speak about many things using different arts. The mathematician using the art of mathematics can talk about math. But what is a rhetorician able to talk about that other people are not able to talk about? And we can see from the beginning this is a weak point, because Gorgias is really saying that the rhetorician, as we're going to see, can talk about anything, which is, a suspicious thing, right? How could anybody really know, the answer to everything by one art? How is that possible? But it's also worth noting that as he's wiggling around on this, one thing that Gorgias identifies is that the rhetorician is an expert in speaking about what's just and unjust. This is because rhetoric is, most of all, the power of rhetoric is shown in the ability to persuade people in the context of government, in legislation, and in the courtroom. So basically, the rhetorician can use the power of government by persuading the people who are in power to use their power in particular ways that are advantageous to the rhetorician. So that's an important specific point that he's interested in. But the larger point is that he has not identified any particular subject. And when we ended last time, we ended with Gorgias coming out and saying, the art of rhetoric is being able to persuade people and therefore to have power. So it's an art of acquiring power. Of course, we've looked at this earlier in the course in Machiavelli, And again, the Gorgias as a whole is going to be Socrates' response to this Machiavellian notion that the purpose of life is all about acquiring power and maximizing power. And we can see from the beginning that that's really what Gorgias thinks rhetoric is all about, is how to gain power. So let's dive back in and see where the conversation goes. So once Gorgias mentions this thing about power, Socrates says, now, Gorgias, you seem to me to have come closest to revealing rhetoric for the sort of art you take it to be. Again, Socrates is going to deny that what Gorgias is doing is actually an art, but he is right now is just kind of looking to see what Gorgias thinks. He's like, okay, I get what you think now. I get what you're saying it is. And if I'm understanding it all, you're saying that rhetoric is a crafter of persuasion. So it's some kind of a science, we might say, or an art of persuading people. And the whole concern and sum total of it ends with that. So notice that it's about persuasion, and it could be on any topic, but with a particular interest in trying to guide, governmental bodies to do what you want them to do. Or do you have anything further to say that rhetoric has the power to do beyond producing in its hearers persuasion in the soul? So it's important that he mentions the soul here. Tocqueville had told us that the soul is what's missing in Machiavellian thought. And he said, if we want to learn about the soul, we need to go to Socrates. So notice Socrates is introducing the soul here. It's the soul that gets persuaded. Now, how does it get persuaded? And is that really beneficial? And how would this contrast to, for example, his mode of speaking and reasoning and what that does for the soul? That's really, he's setting all this up here with just that little phrase that he inserts. And we'll see much more about that as we go along. But Gorgias' response, nothing, whatever, Socrates. In other words, yeah, you're right. It's all about persuasion. That's what it's all about. You seem to me to be defining it sufficiently because that is the sum total of it. So Socrates has now put its finger on what Gorgias believes and what Gorgias is up to with his life. And let's see where he's going to go with this. So if rhetoric is the power of persuasion, well, what kind of power is that? Here's Socrates' response. You can be sure that I don't know clearly what in the world the persuasion you speak of as coming from rhetoric is, or what things the persuasion is about, even though I have a suspicion of what I imagine you're speaking of and what it's about. Nevertheless, I'll ask you what in the world you say the persuasion that comes from rhetoric is and what things it's about. So notice Socrates keeps doing this. He keeps saying, look, I'm pretty sure I know what your answers are going to be for a lot of things, but I'm going to walk through it step by step. That's one of the rules or the methods that he uses in his dialogical conversational mode, okay, because he is not trying to sort of wow people with a particular, presentation of things. He's not aiming at just any old kind of persuasion. He is aiming at a meticulous analysis of something to try to get at the truth. So he wants to confirm each step to make sure, even if I'm assuming this is what you think, but let me check with you first. He's also going to say later, at any point when they run into a wall, we can go back and we can change your answer and see if changing a previous answer will get us in a better direction, because it's not giving some kind of display like Gorgias was doing. And it's also not a debate where somebody wins or loses. The conversation is, there's a common good. The assumption is we both want to know the truth and we could help each other, including by showing that there's a dead end, by showing that this argument doesn't work. And then we could backtrack and see, is there a different argument that's going to work better? Because we have the same goal, which is to try to figure out the truth of the matter. So he says, I think I know what you think, but I want to make sure that I'm on the right track here. Now, for what purpose am I going to ask you and not say it myself when I have my own suspicion? It's not for your sake, but for the sake of our speech. So he's making it clear here that, again, this is a common good. It's not a personal preference. It's not something that, hey, I happen to like having this type of conversation. Other people like, different ways of speaking. It's for the sake of the speech or the reasoning. It's for the sake of the truth, in other words. in order that might move forward in a way that would make whatever is being spoken of evident to us as much as possible. So making the thing that we're speaking about evident as much as possible, that's a way of saying getting at the objective truth or getting at reality. And that is the purpose of Socratic dialectic, is to help us through speech to get a better understanding of reality and to be able to see where we might have been ignoring something or we might have been distorting something in our thinking, and using this meticulous kind of back and forth dialogue to spot those mistakes and to try to correct them. So Socrates says, "Come on and tell me about rhetoric then. Does it seem to you that only rhetoric produces persuasion, or that other arts do?" We're going back to the same problem again. It seemed like Gorgias had maybe given a highly specific answer. Okay, rhetoric is just about persuasion. But Socrates says, well, we have the same problem, which is that different arts can also persuade people of different things through speech. I mean something like this: when anyone teaches any subject, whatever, does the one who teaches it persuade, or do you think he doesn't? So if I'm teaching you geometry, am I not persuading you of some, okay, this is how geometry works? Or if I'm teaching you, shipbuilding, am I not persuading you this is the way you build a ship? This is the way it goes, right? So every art, insofar as it can be taught, is also a matter of persuasion. Teaching and persuasion seem to, teaching is a kind of persuasion, is basically what Socrates is saying. So we're back to the same problem. There's nothing specific about rhetoric yet that we can see. Oh no, Socrates, Gorgias says, persuading is what he does most of all. So Gorgias doesn't deny that the other arts can persuade, but he's going to say there's something superlative about the way, there's something special about the way that rhetoric persuades people. It's different. So what's going to be the difference? I think Socrates will agree there's a difference, but Gorgias thinks it's a good difference, and Socrates is going to point out it actually doesn't seem to be a good sort of a difference. It seems to be actually a bad difference. So here is Gorgias' attempt to solve this. He says, I say rhetoric is the art of that persuasion that goes on in law courts and in other crowds, as I was in fact saying just now, and that's about those things that are just and unjust. So he's going back again to, okay, we're going to distinguish this by saying that it's about justice and injustice. It's about politics, in other words. It's going to be about law, either making law or enforcing law and judging according to law in the courtroom. So that we've already seen that he's kind of flip-flopping between it can be about anything versus it's about this in particular. I think the reason that he keeps going back to this again is because that's where the power comes from. That's where the most power comes from, is if you can persuade within the context of government. But how is Socrates going to respond now? Socrates is going to show that distinction doesn't particularly solve the problem. That what actually distinguishes Gorgias' rhetoric, again, is something that is not really such a good thing from Socrates' point of view. And he gets at this by saying, do you want us to posit two forms of persuasion? One, that would explain why all these different arts can persuade, but how is rhetoric different in persuading? There's two forms of persuasion. One that provides belief without knowing, another that provides knowledge. So the distinction is pretty simple. You can persuade something of somebody in such a way that could they prove that it's true? Did you prove that it's true to them? Or did you just give them some reasons that makes it seem like it must be true? And the difference is you've persuaded somebody to believe something is true, but they can't necessarily prove it. Where the other kind of persuasion would be showing a proof. Showing somebody proof so they could go and prove it as well. And this is what he calls knowledge, something that we could actually prove is true. And Gorgias not only agrees, but he says very much so. He heartily agrees. He says that, yeah, that's a really important distinction about different ways of persuading. then, we can already see which one he's practicing, right? Does he know all these arts? Does he know all these things that he's persuading people? When he says, I can answer any question, does he know everything? No, he doesn't. So he's not persuading based on knowledge. He's persuading based on belief. He can make people believe anything about anything. He doesn't necessarily know the truth about everything, and nor could he prove everything to everybody. Okay, so Socrates says, which form of persuasion does rhetoric produce in law courts and other crowds about things that are just and unjust? So Socrates, he could have done this with any of the random things that Gorgias claims to be able to answer, but notice that he goes back to this focus on justice, which I think just shows the ultimate implications of this. If you're persuading people of something without actually knowing the truth about it, what is the obvious danger? Well, you could be misleading them on this thing. You could be persuading them of something that may be false because you're not proving that it's true, and maybe you yourself can't really prove whether it's true or not. You can just persuade with these techniques, but you can't prove it. Now, if you apply that to justice or injustice, what does that mean? You could not only be misleading people about the truth about something, but you could be doing it in a way that would cause injustice. You would get them to think that injustice is just or that justice is unjust. And you would therefore, you would thwart justice and you would promote injustice. And so Socrates clarifies this. Is it the one from which believing comes without knowing or from which knowing comes? It's obvious, Gorgias responds, that it's the sort from which believing comes. So yeah, it should be obvious that he doesn't actually know all these things. That's not what his art is, to know the answer to everything. It's only to persuade, not to know, which means that you're making people believe things without necessarily knowing whether they're true or not. Therefore, Socrates says, it looks like rhetoric is a craft or not of persuasion that teaches, but of persuasion into belief about what's just and unjust. But is it just or beneficial to persuade people about what's just or unjust without knowing the answer? Socrates raises this problem in a particular context. He says, come on then, let's see what in the world we're in fact saying about rhetoric, because I can't even tell yet what I'm saying myself. So he's exploring, Socrates is always emphasizing that this is a joint project. He's not trying to preach to Gorgias and say, hey, you're doing something wrong. He's trying to work through this from the inside out and say, what do you think, Gorgias? What about this circumstance? Is that what you're doing? Is that what you want to be doing? Whenever there's a meeting in the city for choosing doctors or shipbuilders or any other confraternity or of public workers, is there any doubt that the rhetorician won't be giving any advice then? Now, why would that be? Because Gorgias had said you can always give advice in these public assemblies and you can persuade people. But would that be just? If people want a doctor or a shipbuilder, do they want one based on belief, that somebody made them believe it's good to hire this person? Or they want knowledge, okay, we have knowledge that this person knows what they're doing and they're going to do it right. What would the consequences be if the city is hiring people based on belief rather than knowledge? Couldn't that be pretty damaging to the city? They're going to get bad medicine, they're going to get bad ships, they're going to get who knows what's going to happen, right? Because it's obvious that in each choice it's necessary to choose the person most skilled in the art. So Socrates is saying, look, you've got an art we're trying to figure out, but there's other arts. You really want to say, to heck with those arts, we don't need them? We can just have rhetoric? Would that make any sense? And he won't when it's about building walls either. That is, the rhetorician won't be able to talk about building walls or about equipping harbors and shipyards, but the engineers will. So we're circling through the same problem over and over again, and Socrates is just showing that you still haven't solved this problem, Gorgias. That when we're talking about something, we want knowledge about it. That's why we're talking about it. So if your art is you're going to persuade people without knowledge, what good is that? Isn't that going to be harmful? Who would want to be persuaded without knowledge? Why would you want that? You want to be fooled? You want to be tricked? doesn't really seem like a strong selling point, right? So how does Gorgias respond to this? He flips it around. He's not looking at it from the point of view of the city or from the person who's getting this advice. He's looking at it just from his own point of view of the rhetorician. Whenever there's any choice about the things you were just speaking of, Socrates, you see that the rhetoricians are the ones who give the advice and carry the motions about these issues. Now, he's pointing out in support of Gorgias here, he's pointing out, something that's an actual fact. Who actually persuades people to vote for things is not necessarily the people who know the art, who know the relevant things. It may be the people who are either professional or just really good at public speaking are the ones who are able to do that. So much the case that, if you had an art you were trying to promote and you wanted, you wanted the government to hire your company or something, you would probably get somebody who's not an expert in the art, but who is an expert speaker who could represent your company, right? And that's the kind of thing that Gorgias is doing. He would get paid big dollars or, the equivalent at the time to go in and persuade an assembly to vote for something on behalf of somebody else. And Socrates knows that that's true, that that's how it actually works. But he says, it's from being amazed at these things too, Gorgias, that I've been asking all along what in the world the power of rhetoric is. So yeah, I know you can do that, and you do that, and it works. But I'm amazed at that. As Socrates is going to point out, there's something wrong about that. There's something that's really fishy about that, even though it does happen. Because when I look at it this way, the greatness of it has the appearance of some supernatural power. So Socrates is leading into a criticism here, but you'll notice that he's not being the least bit, preachy or disparaging about it. He is always, open to the possibility there's some truth that I'm missing. There's something that's really great and glorious here that I need to learn from you. And it's always at the last resort when the person cannot really explain this thing at all, that he has to, reluctantly say, well, is it possible that you're just wrong then? Because you can't really explain this. But in this case, what is the good of persuading people without knowledge? How is that not just a threat that you're going to lead people astray? And Socrates is giving Gorgias every opportunity to find some way to explain that's good. And is it a supernatural power? Like you just somehow the right thing without having to study it or something? Like how does that work? So let's see how Gorgias explains it. Oh, if you knew it all, Socrates, that it holds all powers, if I may put it so, rounded up in subjection to itself. So in a certain sense, he's saying, yeah, but it's not supernatural, of course. So how does rhetoric get the better of any other art and get above any other art? I'll tell you a big sign of this. Often before now, I've gone along with my brother and with other doctors to some sick person who wasn't willing to drink his medicine or to allow the doctor to do any cutting or burning. And when the doctor wasn't able to be persuasive, I did persuade him with no art other than rhetoric. So he just gets back to the sort of experiential facts of it. His brother's a doctor. And so what it comes down to is this. You have a sick person. His brother knows what this person needs. Medicine, surgery, something like that. His brother knows it as an art. But can his brother persuade this person to take their medicine or to submit, to the procedure? Not always. Sometimes he just runs up against somebody who's stubborn. They don't want to do it. They're afraid or whatever. They don't believe him. And Gorgias comes in and he persuades that person with his rhetoric. He uses rhetoric to persuade them. So think about this example. If you assume the best, his brother is a doctor. His brother is recommending what is actually good for this person. And Gorgias comes in and uses rhetoric to make the truth more palatable to this person. Then this, I think, actually is, ironically, this is sort of the ideal of what's going to come out of this dialogue as the ideal for Socratic rhetoric. because there is in the Socratic tradition, kind of starting with this dialogue, there is an endorsement of a certain kind of rhetoric, alongside a warning that we're going to see in this dialogue that rhetoric, as Gorgias actually practices it, or as his students are planning on practicing it, is very dangerous and harmful, and very misleading in terms of human life and what leads to happiness and flourishing. But still, it's important to come back and look at this, that at the end of the day, somebody who does know the truth, whether it's about medicine or about justice or injustice or about anything else, they might in fact have a hard time persuading people. And rhetoric could be helpful if it is coupled with the other arts, and the other arts are being practiced, well, put it together, and that could be a really good thing. But that is, at least at first glance, this is an accidental thing at best. Is there anything particular to rhetoric that anchors it to the truth through any other art? Not necessarily, right? So you take this example. Let's say his brother was actually, wanted to use his medical knowledge to kill somebody, an enemy or something, and said, "Hey, here's your medicine, but it's actually poison." Now, Gorgias could use his rhetoric just in the same way and get this person to take that and then die. So there's nothing about rhetoric per se that requires it to be used for good or truthful purposes. That's one of the consequences of the way he's defining rhetoric, is that it has no necessary connection to what's true or good, and it doesn't matter if something is true or not. You can persuade people anyway. And what are the implications of pursuing that kind of art and teaching that kind of art in this way? And the interesting thing about this is that Socrates doesn't even call attention to this. He doesn't even accuse Gorgias and say, "You're teaching this art that could be used for evil purposes." He doesn't even have to come out and say that. His line of questioning, Gorgias is certainly intelligent enough to see where this is going, and he anticipates this before Socrates even has to go there. So Socrates is not the first one to bring up a negative criticism. He lets Gorgias actually voluntarily say, "Okay, I see what the criticism is, that I'm teaching something that could be used for evil purposes." And here's his response to that without Socrates even having to mention it. He says, "By Zeus." Now this, is a sign that something serious is going on when the characters are swearing by the gods. It tends to mean, okay, there's something of great significance that they're worried about, or they're upset about, or they're trying to do some kind of damage control regarding an issue. And so we can see that this is a sensitive issue for Gorgias, right? "By Zeus," he says, "suppose somebody who's gone regularly to a wrestling school, has his body in good shape, and has become a skilled boxer, should then hit his father and mother or any of his other relations or friends. That wouldn't be any reason why one should hate the trainers or those who teach people to fight in armor, or should throw them out of the cities." So you see, his concern is that he's going to be accused of corrupting people and get thrown out of the city. Ironically, that's what's going to happen to Socrates. He will be accused of corrupting the youth and put to death for it. But Gorgias, in a sense, could be in danger of that. If he didn't have the skills to protect himself, which he does, then that could be a threat for him, because Socrates is not the only one who could realize that the guy is tricking people and he's teaching people how to trick people, and they might be upset about that, right? But he says, "Why would you blame me?" Because you don't blame the people who teach people how to fight. They train people how to fight. If the person gets that training and goes and abuses that to attack their parents or do some other injustice, you don't blame the trainers. You blame the person who misused the training that they got. They passed on the skills to be used in a just manner against enemies and people who do injustice, by those who are defending themselves, not starting anything, and those who pervert their strength and their art aren't using them rightly. So Gorgias, we can see he's an effective speaker, right? He very effectively says, hey, it would be unjust for you to blame me if anybody, misuses my art, because obviously I'm teaching my art for the sake of it being used in a just manner. And if somebody decides to use it unjustly, it's not my fault. Okay, in a certain technical sense, this is true. But notice that Gorgias has been selling his art as a way of getting power. He's been emphasizing you get power by persuading people in the law courts and the assemblies, by persuading people about justice and injustice. And yet he readily admits that it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. And it's a selling point that he's using to sell. He's charging a lot of money for this. You don't need to bother figuring out if it's true or not. If you use rhetoric, you can always get people to believe it. Okay, so is this defense of himself, is this really sincere? Is in his heart, does he really believe that he is using rhetoric for just purposes and his students will use rhetoric for just purposes? By the end of the dialogue, I think it'll be overwhelmingly clear that this is not the case. But we can already strongly suspect that because of the way that he markets his art. He's marketing it as something by which you can become powerful, you can become rich and powerful, and you don't need to worry about the truth of things. That's irrelevant to this art, and that's the beauty of it. You don't have to bother with that. So in this case, how do you know what's just or unjust? In which art, by the way, it's not one of the regular arts. I mean, being a lawyer would be an example of what's just or unjust according to the laws of your community. But how would you know what is actually just or unjust in the ultimate sense? This is what, of course, Socrates is most interested in with his philosophical dialectics. And clearly that is not part of what Gorgias is teaching his students. And therefore, although Gorgias says, you could train people in, fighting and you expect them to use that for justice, but would it not be important, if you're training people in fighting, would it not be important to include that as part of the training? What is a just or an unjust use of force? If you're teaching people effective use of force, but you're not teaching them to distinguish that, aren't you in fact responsible for letting them loose on the world, knowing that there's a probability that they're going to be misusing it? Now, you can't guarantee, even if you try to teach the right use, you can't guarantee that they won't abuse it. But shouldn't that at least be part of the teaching? And for Gorgias, clearly it is not. So now Socrates starts getting into the criticism. And, we've seen that he gives Gorgias ample opportunity to explain himself and to clarify things. And then after a while, Socrates always gets to the, okay, you've had your say, you've said, what you think about this. But then he exposes, contradictions. There's contradictions in what you're saying. It doesn't add up. It's not really possible that what you're saying is true. It can't all be true anyway, because there's things in it. He says, you seem to be now to be saying things that don't entirely follow from or harmonize with the things you were saying at first about rhetoric. So he's going to review and say, why we're at a dead end here. We're at an impasse because you've said things that don't really fit together with each other. So I'm afraid to refute you in case you might get the idea that I'm speaking not from a desire to get on top of the matter at hand by making it clear, but to come out on top of you. So this is a crucial question. We've noted before that Socrates' method of dialectics is all aimed at trying to get at the truth. It's not about winning a debate. It's not about putting on a show. It's about getting at the truth. But we know that Gorgias' rhetoric is about putting on displays, and it's about persuading people and getting power. So Socrates has good reason to fear, as he puts it here, that Gorgias is not really philosophical. That is, he's not really putting the truth first, right? He wants power, he wants victory, and that's why he cultivates rhetoric. So that means that if Gorgias is having this conversation, at what point does he decide that this conversation is not serving my purposes? It's not helping to empower me. It's actually exposing that I don't really know the answers to some vital questions that I should know the answers to. So for Socrates, that's exactly when you got to keep going when you see that, because that's how you can get at the truth. But if Gorgias doesn't really care about the truth, then he's only going to get more upset the more that Socrates pushes into this, right? Bear in mind, Socrates, he's going to get a warning at the end of this dialogue. You're going to get yourself killed, Socrates. And he does get himself killed eventually by asking these questions. So this is not a light thing here where he says, I'm kind of afraid to go further with you. So he asks him, what kind of person are you, Gorgias? If you're the same sort of person I am, I'd be glad to go on questioning you. But if not, I'd let it go. And what sort of person am I? One who's glad to be refuted if I say anything that's not true, and glad to do the refuting if anyone says anything that's not true, and no less glad to be refuted than to do the refuting. So it's not, for Socrates, it's not personal. My opinions, I don't identify myself with my opinions to the point where it's an attack on me if somebody attacks my opinion. What I want is the truth. So if I'm making a mistake and somebody corrects me, that's a benefit to me. But likewise, if I'm trying to help somebody else and what they want is the truth, then I'm going to need to be able to correct them as well. So the question is what kind of person Gorgias is, and Socrates comparing what kind of person he is. But it's not personal, like putting the truth first. It's not simply that's Socrates' preference, and Gorgias may or may not, have the same preference. But the rationale behind this we see in the next sentence, because I consider that being refuted a greater good insofar as it's a greater good to be set free oneself from the greatest evil than to set someone else free. So what happens when I'm refuted is I'm being set free from the greatest evil. Now, this is one of the many times that Socrates is saying something indirectly. He's mentioning what's the greatest evil. Now, that's a very important statement, right? What's the greatest evil in the world? He doesn't say the greatest evil is X. He implies or insinuates that the greatest evil is to be in error about something, particularly about what's just or unjust, right? So the greatest good, he's implying, is to know what is true and good and beautiful. The greatest evil is to be misled about what is true and good and evil. So this is what Socrates' position is. It's not that he prefers to pursue the truth for his own personal reasons, is that this is what the greatest good and evil are for human beings as such. As rational animals, we are orientated towards the good, the true, and the beautiful. And if we miss them, then we're missing our whole purpose of existence. And so if somebody corrects us, then they are doing us a great benefit. They're setting us free from something that was going to make us unhappy. Since I can imagine no evil as being so great for human beings, a false opinion about precisely those things that our speech is about. So the stakes are huge here. But he said, Gorgias, you're persuading people without knowledge on topics where knowledge of the truth is the greatest good and ignorance is the greatest evil. So you are taking tremendous risks. And that's, of course, for the people he's talking to, the audience. He might be leading them astray towards the greatest unhappiness, but it also is implicitly about Gorgias, because if he's persuading others without knowledge about what's just and unjust, did he ever bother to try to look for knowledge of that for himself? If not, if he's ignorant of what's just and unjust because he doesn't need to know that, and doesn't really care about it, then he himself is missing out on the greatest good and he's suffering the greatest evil. So we've already seen that Gorgias is not going to admit that he doesn't really care about justice or he doesn't really care about the truth. But does he? Given his profession, given what he's told us about his profession, it seems like he is systematically indifferent to those things. And let's say that Gorgias were a pure Machiavellian. I don't necessarily think that's the case, but let's say he was. Machiavelli would say, you don't really care about being truthful or about being just. etc. But you always have to pretend that you care about those things. So at the very least, Gorgias is not going to admit that he doesn't care about them. But what are his actions going to tell us? Let's watch and see how he reacts, and let's look at his words, but also his actions. But of course, this is just the beginning of the dialogue, so we're going to want to keep watching Gorgias throughout the dialogue and see how he responds throughout the dialogue, because just a little spoiler alert, Gorgias is going to, at least there's going to be, strong hints that Gorgias is perhaps changing his mind or something is happening to him during this dialogue. But at the beginning here, here's how he responds. I do indeed claim that I myself am the sort of person you indicate, Socrates. Maybe we should give some thought to the preference of those present, though. So you notice that he says, oh yeah, I care about, he doesn't come out and say, yes, I love the truth. I love, he says, oh yeah, sure, I'm that kind of person. So he's being kind of vague, right? Not very credible. And then in the same breath, he says, oh, but these people here, let's think about their feelings. Like they don't care about these questions you're asking, Socrates. We're boring them, right? Because I tell you, before you two even got here, I gave those present a display of many things for a long time, and now we'll be drawing things out too far if we have a conversation. Oh, they're tired. They listen to me talking, and they're going to listen to this conversation? No, they don't have the energy for that. It's only right to consider their preferences too, so we don't detain any of them who want to do something else. So you notice the way, first of all, this really shows us about Gorgias's real attitude, right? He is about pleasing the crowd. He's not about the truth. His claim here is a very lame one. He makes barely an effort to try to indicate that, oh yeah, I care about the truth. He doesn't even say it. He just says, oh, sure, and then he moves on saying, yes, but let's think about their preferences and let's think about, their convenience. And it's about preference. He's treating even Socrates' desire for truth as a preference, which, as we've just seen, is not the case. Socrates is claiming this is what makes people happy or unhappy. So it's as if Gorgias is saying, well, maybe we would be concerned about happiness and unhappiness, but these people here don't care about happiness or unhappiness. They're tired, what sense does that make? Who would say, oh, I don't care about being happy or not? So clearly he's not actually on the same wavelength as Socrates, and he's trying to wiggle out, and he's going to use the crowd as an excuse and say, oh, I would be happy to talk to you, but I don't want to burden these people. So let's call it a day, okay? But it doesn't work. Let's see what happens. Chaerephon butts in. Well, Gorgias and Socrates, you yourselves hear the racket these men are making. Now, what kind of racket is it? They're bored? They want to move on? No, because they want to hear anything you might say. And for my own part, far be it from me to be so busy that doing anything else becomes more important than speeches of this sort spoken in this way for me to pass them up. So Chaerephon, of course, is Socrates' friend. So we might think, well, he just has the same preference as Socrates, so it doesn't prove anything, right? He's interpreting that the rest of the crowd thinks the way he does, but maybe he's wrong. But now comes Callicles. And remember, Callicles opened the dialogue. He's hosting this event. And he's actually going to end up being one of the main interlocutors of Socrates later on in the dialogue. But now he plays a very important role. He says, by the gods, Chaerephon. Again, an oath showing that, there's something very emotional about this, something that he finds very significant, and he's slamming his fist here on this point. I too have been present at many speeches before now, and I don't know when I've ever enjoyed myself so much as right now. Now, just think about that. He just heard Gorgias give a big speech, and he's saying, I have never been so excited about a speech as this short exchange that we just saw between Gorgias and Socrates. So Socrates is already winning the day. Now, Callicles is going to give Socrates a really hard time later, and he's going to tell Socrates, you are completely wrong about all these things. He's not at all convinced by Socrates yet, but in a certain sense, he's already being won over by Socrates because he finds Socrates' mode of speaking, of dialogue, to be more exciting than listening to the monologues. So for me, even if you want to go on with the conversation all day long, you'll be doing me a favor. So it's not just Socrates' friend, Chaerephon. It's also the man who's going to be a major opponent of Socrates, Callicles, who is also very eager to have this discussion. Because what we're going to see is Callicles is really going to be concerned about the truth. And ironically, he's a very Machiavellian man. He thinks that truth and justice don't matter. But by golly, he believes that it's true that they don't matter. And so he really is going to want to prove that the truth is that the truth doesn't matter. And but in a certain sense, he believes that's true, and he wants to know it's true. And if somebody's going to challenge that, he wants to go through that argument and prove it one way or the other. And that's exactly what Socrates is going to need. So it backfires on Gorgias. Gorgias is not able to wiggle out of this conversation. And Socrates, calls attention to that here. He says, well, Callicles, nothing on my side prevents it so long as Gorgias is willing. So it's all on Gorgias's shoulders here as to whether he's going to be up to having this discussion with Socrates that he can already tell he's not prepared for, because it's all going to be about the truth, and that's what he systematically ignores in his method of speaking. But he's ashamed now. He says, it would be a shameful thing indeed after that, Socrates, for me not to be willing, when I myself promised that anyone could ask whatever he wants. So he admits that he has boxed himself in here. There's no way that he can get out, even though clearly he would like to. So if that seems good to these people here, that, by the way, is a formula that comes from Athenian democracy. If it seems good to the majority, then it's the law. That's Plato will use that kind of phrasing in his dialogues to always remind us that Socrates eventually will be put to death, because it seems good to these people for him to be put to death. But in the dialogues, Socrates is often quite successful, actually, at swaying the choices of the people, showing, I think, Socrates actually could have had a lot of power in Athens if he had actually wanted to. But anyhow, if it seems good to them, go on with the conversation and ask whatever you want. So Socrates is victorious here. He is the one who persuaded. Notice that Gorgias is the master of persuasion, but Socrates is the one who persuades Gorgias through persuading the others to basically pressure Gorgias. That's Gorgias's technique that he uses to get the majority to pass a law, to get what Gorgias wants. Socrates gets the majority of these people to basically rule in his favor that there has to be a conversation. So next time, we'll take it from here and see where that conversation with Gorgias that he tried to get out of is going to go.